Most people live as if time is limitless, believing that there will always be a later to chase dreams, fix mistakes, and build a life they truly want. But what if I told you that by the time you reach 60, the things that matter most will have already changed permanently? And worse, you might realize it too late. This is a story of Thomas Carter, a man who spent his life chasing success, only to wake up at 62 with a startling realization. He had won the game of life, but lost the things that made it worth playing. Thomas had done everything right. He worked hard, built a thriving business, and provided his family with everything they could ever need. He had a big house, luxury cars, and a retirement fund that could last 2 lifetimes. But as he sat alone in his grand living room on his 62nd birthday, staring at his silent phone, he felt a chill of emptiness he couldn't shake. His wife, Margaret, had left him 5 years ago, not because of betrayal, but because of neglect. "I got tired of being alone in a marriage," she had said. At the time, he was too busy to fight for her. His son, Daniel, was successful in his own right, but distant. Calls were rare, visits even rarer. "You were never really around when I was a kid, Dad," Daniel had once said. "I guess I learned to live without you." And now, sitting in his beautiful home, surrounded by everything except the people he loved, Thomas finally understood. At 30, Thomas believed success was measured in wealth. At 40, he thought it was about status and power. At 50, he told himself he still had time to make things right. At 60, he realized time had made its own decisions for him. His body was slower, his face lined with regrets. The friends he had neglected for work had moved on. The woman he once loved had built a life without him. His son had grown into a man who no longer needed or wanted his presence. And for the first time, he understood a painful truth. You don't lose people all at once. You lose them little by little. In the moments you don't show up, Thomas sat with that realization for days, letting it sink in. He thought about calling Margaret, about reaching out to Daniel, but the fear of rejection paralyzed him. Could he fix decades of absence with a single phone call? One evening, after much hesitation, he picked up the phone and dialed his son's number. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Hey, Dad." It was cautious, guarded, but it wasn't rejection. Thomas took a deep breath. "I know I've missed a lot, son, and I don't expect anything from you. But if you're willing, I'd like to try and be present. Even now." A pause. Then a sigh. "I don't know, Dad," Daniel admitted, "but maybe we start small." Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat. Maybe it was too late to rewrite the past, but it wasn't too late to show up now. And sometimes that was enough. The biggest tragedy in life isn't failure. It's thinking you'll always have more time. Most people don't realize what truly matters until their health fades. Their children grow up, and their relationships slip through their fingers. But by then, the damage is done. So, if you're reading this and still have the chance to choose presence over productivity, love over ambition, do it now. Because once time makes its choice, you don't get a second chance. Thomas sat in his dimly lit office, the weight of Daniel's cautious response lingering in his mind. Maybe we start small. It wasn't the warm embrace of forgiveness he had hoped for, but it was something. And at 62, he had learned that something was better than nothing. For years, he had been a master of negotiation, sealing million-dollar deals with confidence. But now, the most fragile contract of his life, his relationship with his son, was on the table. And this time, there were no shortcuts, no quick fixes. So, he took the first step. A week later, Thomas called Daniel again. "Hey, Dad." Less hesitant this time. Thomas cleared his throat. "I was wondering if you'd like to grab lunch this weekend. No expectations. Just a meal." A pause. Then a sigh. "Yeah. Okay." Thomas released a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Familiar, yet different. When Thomas walked into the small cafe where they agreed to meet, he almost didn't recognize his son. Daniel was now a man in his mid-30s, his hair slightly graying at the temples, just like Thomas's had at that age. He had his mother's sharp eyes, the ones that used to look at Thomas with love before they turned cold with disappointment. For the first time in decades, Thomas wasn't in a boardroom. He wasn't the boss. He was just a father trying to reconnect with a son who had every reason to shut him out. They sat, exchanged pleasantries, and awkwardly navigated the first few minutes. But then Thomas did something he had never done before. He listened. He listened as Daniel spoke about his job, his struggles, his successes. He asked questions without checking his watch. He didn't offer advice or try to impress him. He just showed up. By the time they left the cafe, there was no dramatic reconciliation, no sudden flood of emotions. But there was something else, a quiet understanding that this wasn't a one-time event. Before parting, Daniel turned and said, "Same time next week?" Thomas smiled. "I like that." As the weeks passed, Thomas continued to rebuild his relationship with his son. They started having regular lunches, then weekend walks. Daniel introduced him to his wife, then, eventually, his two young daughters. The first time his granddaughter climbed onto his lap, calling him Grandpa, Thomas felt something crack open inside him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Love, not the kind earned through paychecks or business deals, but the kind that required presence, patience, and time. One evening, as Thomas sat reflecting on how much he had already regained, he made another call, the one he had avoided the most. Margaret answered on the third ring. "Thomas." He took a deep breath. "Yeah, it's me." Silence. Then a soft sigh. I wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Not to win you back. Not to undo the past. Just to let you know that I understand now. And I regret the way I took you for granted." A long pause. Then a quiet chuckle. "Took you a few decades, huh?" He laughed, wiping his eyes. "Yeah, guess I'm a slow learner." Another pause, but this time it wasn't heavy with anger. "I appreciate that, Thomas," Margaret finally said. "I really do." They didn't make plans. There was no talk of reconciliation. But that night, Thomas slept better than he had in years. Because even if he couldn't fix the past, he had finally done the one thing that mattered. He had tried. As Thomas continued his life, he knew he would never get back the years he had lost. But he had learned something priceless. It's never too late to change, but the longer you wait, the more you'll wish you had started sooner. He had spent decades chasing success, only to realize that the true wealth of life was in the relationships he had nearly let slip away. And though time had stolen much from him, he still had now. And this time, he wouldn't waste it. Years passed, but this time, Thomas counted them differently. Not by profits or promotions, but by moments. His weekly lunches with Daniel became routine, not just for them, but for Daniel's family too. His granddaughters, Sophie and Ella, grew up knowing him not as the absent father their dad once resented, but as Grandpa Tom, the man who always showed up with stories, laughter, and a pocket full of candy. Margaret and Thomas never rekindled their marriage, but their relationship softened into something else, friendship. They exchanged calls on birthdays, shared meals on holidays, and in time, even laughed about the past. One evening, over coffee, she asked him, "Do you regret it, the way things turned out?" He thought for a long time before answering. "I regret waiting so long," he admitted. "But I don't regret trying, even when I thought it was too late." Margaret nodded, a small smile on her lips. "I'm glad you did." At 78, Thomas knew his time was limited. His once strong body had weakened, and his movements were slower. But unlike before, he wasn't afraid of time slipping away, because this time he had lived it right. On his last birthday, surrounded by Daniel's family, he sat quietly as his granddaughters ran around the yard, their laughter filling the air. Daniel, now in his late 40s, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Dad," he said, voice thick with emotion, "I'm really glad we got this time together." Thomas looked at his son, the man he had nearly lost, but somehow found again. "So am I, son," he said, gripping his hand. "So am I." When Thomas passed away a year later, his funeral wasn't filled with business associates or former colleagues. It was filled with family, with love. Daniel stood before the small gathering, holding back tears as he spoke. "My father taught me something in his later years that I'll never forget," he said. "That time may take things from you, but it also gives you the chance to change, if you're brave enough to take it." He glanced at his daughters, then at the sky, as if his father were listening. He took that chance. And because of that, I got my dad back. And my daughter's got a grandfather they'll never forget. As the service ended and people began to leave, Margaret lingered at Thomas's grave. She placed a single flower down, whispering, "You finally got it, Tom." And somewhere, if souls could smile, Thomas did. Regret is heavy, but change is always possible. Thomas Carter's story wasn't about a perfect life. It was about a man who realized, even in his later years, that the time he had left was worth living right. So if you're reading this, don't wait until 60. Don't wait until you've lost what matters most. Because no matter how much money you have, no matter how much success you achieve, when the end comes, the only thing you'll truly wish for is more time with the people you love. And if you're lucky enough to still have that time, use it now. Months after Thomas's funeral, life moved on, as it always does. But his absence was deeply felt, not as a painful void, but as a quiet presence in the hearts of those he had left behind. Daniel found himself thinking of his father more often than he expected. He had spent so much of his younger years resenting the man who was never there, only to realize too late that people can change if given the chance. One afternoon, as he sorted through his father's belongings, he found an old, leather-bound journal. It was filled with scribbled reflections from Thomas's later years, raw, honest, and full of the regrets he had once carried. "I wish I had learned sooner that success means nothing if you have no one to share it with. I used to think love was something that could wait. I was wrong. Maybe I won't get to rewrite my past, but at least I can make peace with it." Daniel wiped his eyes, closing the journal. His father's greatest lesson wasn't just in the words he had written. It was in the life he had lived after realizing what truly mattered. That evening, Daniel sat on the porch, watching his daughters play. His wife, Emily, sat beside him, sipping tea. "You've been quiet," she said gently. He exhaled, "Just thinking about my dad. About how different things could have been if he had never tried to change." Emily nodded. "He made the effort, Daniel, and that effort changed everything, even if he started late." Daniel turned to his wife, reaching for her hand. "I don't want to make the same mistake." She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He looked at his daughters, then back at her. "I don't want to wait until I'm old to realize what matters most. I don't want to spend my life thinking I'll always have more time." Emily smiled, squeezing his hand. "Then don't." The next weekend, Daniel did something he had never done before. He took a day off from work, not for an emergency, not for an obligation, but just to be present. He took his daughters to the park, laughed as they dragged him onto the swings, and let the weight of responsibility melt away for a little while. Later, they baked cookies in the kitchen, flour covering every surface, but no one cared. And as he tucked them into bed that night, Sophie looked up at him and asked, "Daddy, will you always be around?" He swallowed hard, thinking of his own childhood, of all the times he had wished his father would say yes to that question. So he leaned down, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Always." Thomas Carter had left behind no great empire, no company bearing his name, but his true legacy wasn't in wealth or status. It was in a son who chose to show up, in granddaughters who would grow up knowing their father was present, in a family that had been healed because one man had dared to change before it was truly too late. And so, in the end, Thomas's story didn't die with him. It lived on in the choices his son made, in the love that was passed down, in the lesson that time does run out. But if you act now, you might just have enough to make it count. Years passed, but Thomas's impact never faded. Daniel, now in his 50s, found himself standing in his father's old office, running his fingers over the worn wooden desk. It had been a decade since Thomas passed, yet in moments like this, it felt like he was still there, watching, guiding, reminding. The leather-bound journal still sat on the shelf, now a little dustier, but never forgotten. Daniel often reread its pages, especially on days when work felt all-consuming, when the pull of success threatened to steal his presence from the people he loved most. He had made a promise to himself after Thomas's death. "I won't wait until it's too late." And unlike his father, he had the chance to keep it. One evening, As Daniel sat with Emily on their porch, watching the sun dip below the trees, she turned to him with a soft smile. "You know what today is?" she asked. Daniel thought for a moment. "It's just a Friday." Emily chuckled. "It's the first time in over 20 years that you haven't checked a single work email all day." He blinked, surprised. Then slowly he smiled. "Guess I finally figured it out," he admitted. She nodded. "Your dad would be proud." Daniel glanced at the sky, as if searching for something or someone among the fading light. He had spent much of his life resenting his father for his absence, only to realize that even late change had the power to ripple through generations. Thomas hadn't just changed his own life. He had changed Daniel's, too. And now, Daniel was passing that lesson down to his daughters, ensuring that they never had to wonder if their father would be there. One day, while cleaning out old storage boxes, Daniel found something unexpected. An envelope, yellowed with time, addressed to him in his father's handwriting. It had never been delivered. With shaking hands, he opened it. "Dear Daniel, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to give this to you, but I need to write it anyway. If you're reading this, it means I didn't get to say everything I wanted to. And God, son, there's so much I want to say. I wasted too many years chasing the wrong things, believing that love and family could wait. I thought I had time. I thought you would always be there when I was finally ready. But life doesn't work that way. And I nearly lost you because of it. I know I can't undo the past, but I hope that in my final years, you saw that I tried. And I hope, more than anything, that you won't make the same mistakes I did. If you take one thing from my life, let it be this. Time isn't a guarantee. Don't waste it. Love the people in front of you, not the dreams that can wait. Choose presence over regret. Choose love over ambition. And Daniel, please know that even when I failed, I always loved you. I just didn't know how to show it. I hope I did better in the end. With love, Dad." Daniel wiped his eyes, closing the letter carefully. Then, with a deep breath, he folded it back into the envelope, not to hide it, but to keep it. A reminder, a lesson, a legacy, one he would never forget. Daniel sat on the porch, staring at the letter long after the sun had set. His father's words echoed in his mind, words of regret, of love, of hard-earned wisdom. For so many years, he had resented Thomas for the time he had missed. But now, as a father himself, he understood something painful yet true. No one gets it right from the start. Life is a series of choices, some good, some bad. But what truly matters is whether you choose to change before it's too late. Thomas had made that choice. And now, Daniel would honor it. That weekend, Daniel took his daughters on a road trip. Just the three of them. No emails, no business calls, just stories, laughter, and music blasting to the car speakers. Sophie, now a teenager, smirked as she watched her father struggle with directions. "Dad, you're so bad at this." Daniel laughed, glancing at her in the rear-view mirror. "Well, at least I'm here to be bad at it." Ella, younger and always curious, asked, "Did Grandpa ever take you on a road trip?" Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sweetheart. But I think, if he had the chance, he would have." Sophie leaned forward. "You really miss him, huh?" Daniel swallowed. "Yeah, I do." And for the first time, the ache in his heart wasn't just sadness. It was gratitude. His father had left behind more than regrets. He had left behind a lesson, a second chance passed down through generations. Months later, on what would have been Thomas's 80th birthday, Daniel visited his father's grave. He brought two things, a single white rose and a letter Thomas had written all those years ago. He knelt down, running his fingers over the name carved in stone. Thomas Carter, a man who learned too late, but still tried. Smiling softly, Daniel unfolded the letter and placed it beside the flower. "I got the message, Dad," he whispered, "and I promise I won't wait until it's too late." Then he stood up, took a deep breath, and walked away, toward the life he still had, toward the family he wouldn't neglect, toward the love he wouldn't take for granted. And in that moment, the cycle was finally broken, not with regret, not with guilt, but with love. And that, in the end, was the legacy Thomas Carter had left behind.